Welcome to this webinar on searchability and standardized ontologies that's sponsored by the Critical Path Institute and the National Organization of Rare Disorders as part of the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform virtual workshop in the fall of 2020. I am Ramona Walls, the newest member of the Critical Path Data Collaboration team. So if you're joining this talk, presumably you have already heard of ontologies. You might be using them in your work. You may be considering using them or wondering how you can use them, or you might just be wondering why you should even care about ontologies. The issue is this: the biomedical community knows a lot about diseases, about symptoms and treatments, but the community as a whole lacks a good understanding of most rare diseases. Even though collectively there's a lot of data out there about rare diseases, most of those data are diverse, heterogeneous, and dispersed. As a result, even basic natural history is unknown for most rare diseases. What we want to be able to do is bring all of that data and knowledge together into a usable format so that we can start to discover cures and treatments for rare diseases. With ontologies, we can use all this existing knowledge to generate hypotheses and discover new information about rare diseases based on how similar one collection of data is to another. That is the semantic similarity between those two data collections. We can use ontology-based systems to ask questions like, which diseases share similar phenotypes or progressions, and do they have the similar genetic basis? Or what treatments work for diseases with similar symptoms? To put this into context, I'll give a very specific example. Imagine that I have a rare disease that causes me to fall a lot due to issues with my gait. However, unfortunately, there are no known treatments for my particular disease because it's very rare. So how can I discover what treatments have been effective for other diseases, be they rare diseases or even common diseases that have gait issues, even if those diseases have been classified using different names for the symptoms, different vocabularies, and different data types? Ontologies allow us to address questions like this. So this is a fairly big claim that I'm making here, but let me sort of walk you through what ontologies are and how they work to try to convince you that such things are possible with ontology-based data systems. I'm going to start by giving an introduction to ontologies, what they are and how they're useful, and then give some examples of how ontologies can be used to integrate rare disease data with some specific examples of how ontologies are being used right now to help understand and treat rare diseases. Then I'll wrap up with a brief discussion of what ontologies can bring to the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator data and analytics platform. So what is an ontology? That's our first question. Wikipedia defines an ontology as a set of concepts and categories that represent a subject. And this is true, but it doesn't really do justice to what an ontology is completely. So glossaries, taxonomies, and thesauri also contain sets of concepts and categories that represent a subject. What sets an ontology apart is that of all of these types of vocabularies, ontologies are have the most semantic expressivity. That is, they capture the most knowledge and information. So I like to think of an ontology as specialized code that translates human knowledge into a machine-readable form and supports logical inference by computers. And I'm going to go through all of those steps and how those work in the coming slides. I included this last bullet point, which is that ontology is also a branch of philosophy, not because I want to wax philosophical. This is the last time I'll mention philosophy in this talk, but I do think it's important to bear in mind that the computer science uses ontologies does stem from philosophy, and that your choice of you make philosophical choices whenever you design and build an ontology, and those choices are bound to impact the functionality of your ontology. So it does pay to remember the history and where you come from when you're building ontologies. So rather than give a bunch of bullet points about ontologies, I'd like to walk through an example, a general purpose example on a topic that I hope all of you are familiar with, and that's ice cream. So I'm going to start with talking about how we use ontologies to standardize and structure vocabulary. So suppose that I work for an ice cream manufacturer, and I've been tasked with building a data system that organizes the ice cream inventory in our warehouse and all of the information about it. And I've decided to do that using an ontology. So the first thing I want to start to do is by defining all of the categories or concepts within our domain of ice cream. And I've decided to do this within an existing ontology on food products they have a branch for dairy products. And within that, I've created a new branch called ice cream product. And so you can see what I'm doing here is creating classes, and classes are, again, terms in the ontology for those general concepts or those even very specific concepts within the particular domain, in this case, ice cream. So I've got a class for ice cream product, and it has more specific subclasses like soft serve ice cream sundae, bulk ice cream, and each of those classes in turn have more specific subclasses like Rocky Road bulk ice cream or chocolate bulk ice cream. So what we've done is essentially build a hierarchy that defines in a standardized way all of the different ice creams that we were interested in our warehouse. And this in itself is very useful. We can use it to then control and standardize the inventory of our ice cream. And the way that we do that is by creating instances of those classes, which are also sometimes called individuals. So each instance has a unique identifier. And if we look just at the first row of this table, we've got an item 2389752. And we define that as an instance of the class, which has a URL in the second row, and that class is labeled creamsicle. And so because the class has a URL that's resolvable, our data are now automatically linked and available through the web. But we might want to include some additional information in our database associated with that. So we'd also add, for example, the date that the package of creamsicles was added to our inventory and the shelf where it's located. So what we've done is we built this computerized graph structured database for all of the different ice creams in our warehouse now. And we've used an ontology to standardize all of the way that we describe the ice creams. And that's in itself quite useful, but it doesn't really take advantage of the full utility of ontologies. Right now, what we've done is essentially a taxonomy that could be done that does not include any sort of advanced logical features such as ontologies can include. So let's look at a slightly more complex example of using ontologies to infer new facts. Now I've got a new job and I'm working at an ice cream marketing company. And my job is to go out and to gather information about all the restaurants in my area, what kind of ice cream products they're selling and what kind of ingredients they might need to buy and stock to serve those ice creams. So I can use the same ontology again. But instead of just inventorying individual ice cream products in my factory, what I'm going to do now is go to all of the different restaurants in the area and input the data from their menus and create data items for each of the different ice cream products that they're selling. So for example, I can look at here the Dino Sundae, which is being sold by Brewster's Ice Cream. But instead of assigning the ice cream sundae to a specific class, instead of making it an instance of a class in the ontology a priori, what I'm going to do is list all of the ingredients in the particular ice cream product and let the ontology decide what class this product should be an instance of. So again, if we look at the Dino Sundae, it contains Brewster's ice cream, a dinosaur cookie, Brewster's chocolate sauce, and sprinkles. Taking that into an ontology, now I'm showing the interface for a popular ontology tool called Protege. You can see that I've created an instance or an individual called Dino Sundae, and all the way on the bottom right, I've written logical axioms in my ontology, so computerized code that tells the computer that my ice cream sundae has ingredients, ice cream, Dino cookie, and Brewster's chocolate sauce. I've left off the sprinkles for brevity here. And then I've written a definition for what an ice cream sundae is that says an ice cream sundae is a food product that has the ingredients some sweet sauce and has an ingredient some bulk ice cream or soft serve ice cream. Then I can use a special tool called a reasoner, and a reasoner takes this logical definition, the content, the information in the ontology, along with the data that I fed into it about the different instances, and it generates new facts, and it tells me that a Dino Sundae is in fact an ice cream sundae because it has some sweet sauce and some ice creams in its ingredients. You'll notice, however, that it also tells me that it's an ice cream sandwich. Why does it do that? Because an ice cream sandwich is defined as containing as ingredients some ice cream and some cookie. And a Dino Sundae contains a cookie. So the nice thing about reasoners and ontologies is not only that can they classify your data into specific categories, but they can also help you find mistakes in your ontology. In this case, what we would probably need to do to fix it would be to make a more specific definition for ice cream sandwich that says, for example, that it contains 2 cookies and that the ice cream is sandwiched in between them. So that's great. This is really interesting in ice cream. What about in the real world of rare diseases and disorders? So this is already being done in many different ontologies in the biomedical community. I'm showing a brief example here from the human phenotype ontology that has defined a class called hepatic fibrosis as having a part some fibrotic that adheres in some liver and has modifier some abnormal. Because of that definition, the human phenotype ontology and a reasoner can automatically infer that hepatic fibrosis is a subclass of abnormal liver morphology. So you heard me saying that sentence, and there's lots of words in there like adheres and a modifier some abnormal that nobody would ever actually, except an ontologist, would ever actually use in day-to-day speech. So you might be thinking, that's great, but how can I actually use this to find the data that I have? Do I have to go through and map all of these crazy terms to the way that people actually talk? Well, one of the great things about ontologies is that you can actually include multiple labels for the same concept. So for example, here's an image that shows some classes from the human phenotype ontology. And as an example, protopsis also has synonyms for bulging eyes, eyes bulging out, prominent eyes, and prominent lobes. So of the 14,000 so terms in HPO, about 1/3 of them have lay synonyms already associated with them. And this is what makes an ontology really useful for mapping across different vocabularies and tasks such as text mining or natural language processing. Another way that ontologies can be useful, another more advanced use for them, is through polyhierarchy searching. So what do I mean when I say polyhierarchy? Anyone of you who has ever tried to build a classification system and put things into a hierarchical structure will realize that almost everything can have multiple parents. Almost every class can be classified in more than one way. So how do you do that? You can manually go in and put all of your terms into different classifications, but that maintaining that becomes very difficult and it's very error prone. So a better way to maintain those multiple hierarchies is to use your reasoner to use those logical definitions and have your reasoner automatically classify the multiple parents. So in another example from the human phenotype ontology, we might be looking for data related to human stature in diseases. So one researcher might want to ask, find me all the genes associated to abnormal body height. A different researcher might ask, what diseases are associated with delayed growth? Both of those queries are going to return answers associated with classes such as asymmetrical asymmetrical short stature, dwarfism, pituitary dwarfism, etc., because those are subclasses of short stature, and the ontology knows that short stature is a subclass of both growth delay and abnormal body height. And so this multifaceted searching is another great advantage of using ontologies and automatic classification. Finally, one of the most complex ways of using ontologies is through a suite of analysis tools known as semantic similarity. Semantic similarity essentially combines data annotations, that is associations between data and an ontology, and the structure, that hierarchical structure of the ontology, to look for information content in the data, compare 2 data sets and say, how much information content do they share? I'm going to show an example here using a mutation in the PAX6 gene that has been studied not only in humans, but also in mice, zebrafish, and Drosophila, or fruit flies. Each of the data for each of these organisms has been gathered independently and is stored in separate databases. And as a consequence, the descriptions of the phenotypes across those different organisms differ. So they can be quite complex in a human, such that the phenotypic profile or description says cornea opaque, iris absent, retina degenerate, lens opaque, aqueous humor of eyeball, increased pressure, to something as simple in a fruit fly as eyes absent. But what the researchers in this Washington et al. 2009 paper were able to do was to take each of these phenotypic descriptions, what they call phenotypic profiles, annotate them to ontologies, and then look at the similarity across them. And they actually did this for many hundreds of different phenotype profiles, not just this one. And the ontology can then return the information and say, even though their initial descriptions were quite different, the information content shared across all of these, or their semantic similarity, is very high, it's significant. And so that suggests that these different phenotypic profiles should share some similar genetic basis. And in fact, even though, of course, this we already knew, but it returns the information predicting that we should look for the same PAX6 gene across. We know that the PAX6 gene is associated in one organism. We should look for that same mutation in other organisms. So this is a way to predict using, for example, model organism database, of which we have much, and we can do far more experiments than we do on humans, using that model organism database to predict what genes, pathways, etc., would be associated with human phenotype profiles and diseases. This type of semantic similarity can be used not only for genes, but to compare any sets of entities of the same type. So you can compare phenotypes, phenotype profiles, sets of gene annotations, disease profiles, etc. So now that we know some of the ways that ontologies can be used to analyze, to discover, and to generate hypotheses, what can we do within the rare disease community? So the bottom line is that rare disease data is complicated. There are many different types of data. If you look at the Orphanet, for example, the Orphanet homepage, you see that they have data on rare diseases, the genes involved, drugs, patients and organizations, expert centers, thematic reports. There are all different types of data. So how do we start to get a handle on that and put that together into one searchable platform? Fortunately, there are already a number of ontologies that can be used for rare diseases. There's the human phenotype ontology that I already mentioned earlier. There's also a human disease ontology, which has a slightly different scope. The gene ontology that does not describe genes, but rather describes cellular components, molecular functions, and biological processes that are associated to different genes. We've got the uber-odd animal anatomy and development ontology, and several others. What's notable about this list, if you look at the first 8 ontologies in this list, these are examples of community ontology development. Community ontology development relies on input from a broad group of stakeholders and supports multiple use cases. So rather than being developed for a specific application, it's developed for a number of different applications. This helps to keep the ontology current with scientific consensus, and it also makes it more sustainable by having multiple contributors. Yet it still allows for use case specific application ontologies. And if we go back to the table and look at the last 2 on this list, the Mondo disease ontology and the Orphanet rare disease ontology, these are 2 applications that were built for specific projects that reuse many of those community developed ontologies that are listed above. These community ontologies development is really important for projects like the RDCA-DAP, because otherwise you're developing, if we were to go and develop all of our own ontologies and do things independently, we would just end up with silos again, which is precisely what we're trying to avoid through using ontologies. The use of these other ontologies also increases the interoperability of what we're doing with other projects that are also using those ontologies, and solves a lot of problems for us. So it's a great resource to have those already available. Speaking of resources that are already available, I want to give you an example in this next section of 2 projects that are ongoing that are already making use of ontologies to study rare diseases. The first is Orphanet. It's a European-wide project that gathers diverse data and information about rare diseases. It maintains a number of different resources, as I showed you in the earlier slide, including the Orphanet rare disease nomenclature called OrphaCode. It also maintains the Ordo Orphanet rare disease ontology, and in terms of reusing community ontologies, it includes the HPO Ordo ontological model, or WHOM, which links annotations between clinical entities and phenotypic abnormalities in the HPO. So it's linking clinical data and phenotype data. The Monarch initiative is based in the US, though it's also an international effort, and it integrates data. It's an integrative data and analytical platform that connects phenotypes to genotypes across species, bridging basic and applied research with semantic-based analyses. So similar to that picture that I showed you of the diverse the diverse eye phenotypes across organisms, the Monarch initiative and the Mondo ontology that's part of it harmonizes data from many different organisms to human data and makes it possible to link genetic data that's associated with model species to human disease data. They also provide multiple online analysis tools. So both of these projects have slightly overlapping but somewhat different missions. They both focus on rare diseases, and you can go to either one of them to get a lot of very useful information. You can search for a specific rare disease, like Pierpont syndrome. If you do, on the Orphanet page, you get on the Orphanet site, you get a page that looks something like this, that defines the disease, gives you its classification, and has links out to lots of additional information and data. Similarly, if you were to go to the Monarch Initiative, you could and search for Pierpont syndrome, you would get a page that links also to many different types of data sources available, but really focuses on phenotype and genotype information across organisms. And I would like to thank Melissa Hendel and the Monarch Initiative for contributing this slide and this example. Jessica is a 4-year-old girl from England who has a rare condition that causes epilepsy. It affects her movement and it causes developmental delay. But unfortunately, standard genetic tests were negative, so her family had no idea what was causing the problems with her. Fortunately, through the Genomics England program, both Jessica and her parents, they were able to gather full genome sequences for them. And then those sequences were analyzed using tools from the Monarch Initiative, such as ExoMiser. They discovered that of the 6 million or so variants in Jessica's genome, about 600,000 of them were rare. 2,000 of those were predicted to cause a change in a protein, and 67 of them differed from her parents. Using analysis tools, they identified one gene that was the top-ranked gene, the SLC2A1, and that turned out to be the cause of her GLUT1 deficiency syndrome. So they were able to use all of this data, the data that put together model organism data, human data, genomics data, and identify and diagnose a disease that otherwise they would not have been able to treat her for. And now, because of that, her disease is being successfully treated with a ketogenic, low-carb diet. She's at low risk for future pregnancies, and essentially the life of her and her family have been radically changed for the better. So these are the kinds of outcomes that we want to see through the RDCA-DAP, through the Monarch Initiative, through Orphanet. This is why we use ontologies to bring data together into platforms that allow us to make new discoveries and understand connections between data that we couldn't make otherwise. So let me just wrap up by briefly saying what it is we hope to do with RDCA-DAP and ontologies. So as I mentioned in the beginning, RDCA-DAP is a partnership between the Critical Path Institute and the National Organization for Rare Disorders. I'm sorry, I wrote that wrong on the slide. It should say disorders. And it's intended to serve as a neutral, independent data collaboration and analytics hub to promote sharing of critically important data across rare diseases in order to accelerate the understanding of disease progression. This figure shows the architecture, the generalized architecture for the RDCA-DAP. You can see that we'll be bringing in data, many different kinds of data, from clinical trials to natural history data to surveillance data and others, storing those and standardizing them, and storing them into a database that can be accessed through a user-friendly, secure cloud interface. The data that's then available can be used both by the c-path quantitative medical team and other researchers to produce actionable rare disease drug development solutions. This is the project in general, but we also want to bring ontologies into this. And ontologies, the reason we want to use them is that they can make the RDCA-DAP data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or FAIR, which is a term you may have heard discussed a lot recently in the world of data science and data reuse. So how will we be integrating ontologies into this data pipeline? They'll be critically important in the standardization step by providing a standardized common vocabulary across all of the different data sources. That will make it possible to understand when something is said in one source versus another, whether they mean the same thing. They'll also be essential for the user interface that will allow the hierarchical, polyheirarchical, lay term vocabulary searching that I described earlier in the presentation. And then advanced ontological methods like semantic similarity analysis also be important for researchers, both within and outside c-path, to to come up with the hypotheses and the kinds of data that we need for these actionable drug development solutions. So with that, I hope that I've shown you how ontologies can be useful generally and specifically for rare diseases. I just want to wrap up by saying that organizing data based on their meaning, that is using semantics, allows you to search for ideas and answers in data that you could not find otherwise. Using the semantics that come from community-built ontologies is particularly important because of the many use cases they take into consideration, and that those community-built ontologies are the key to flexible, scalable semantic data integration. And finally, there are many great resources already out there for integrating rare disease data. RDCA-DAP aims to bring those together and to improve people's lives. And with that, thank you for your time.